Welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This lecture will cover the material known as Ezra and Nehemiah, two books in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible that tell the story of the return from exile, from some Jews living in Babylon returning to the land of Judah and repatriating that part of the world. In this lecture, I will provide a brief orientation to Ezra and Nehemiah, an orientation to this historical time period, highlight the importance of Ezra, Nehemiah, and then discuss a few of the issues or major topics or concerns of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then offer some reading strategies as always. Once again, I'm glad you're with me. So, a brief word of orientation to Ezra and Nehemiah. Like other works in the Old Testament, Ezra and Nehemiah was originally thought to be one single work. It is similar in that once it was introduced into the Greek tradition, once it was translated into Greek, it became a one or two volume work. Like Daniel and some of the other books that we've seen in the Old Testament, it was originally written in Hebrew, but also has a section of Aramaic. And the reasons why the switch into Aramaic and then back into Hebrew are not altogether clear. It does seem as though the story as it is told in the Old Testament kind of portrays Ezra and Nehemiah as contemporaries, as if they are living at the same time. But when we pay attention to the details in the text and the kings that they are working under, it is in fact very unlikely that they were contemporaries. It seems as though they were decades apart from one another, working quite separately from that time. In terms of the orientation to the historical time period, remember, just as a reminder, that that Second Kings gets us to the end of the time when Judah has a monarchy of its own, and subsequently the people of Judah are deported. They are taken from Judah and repatriated in Babylon, and this begins the Babylonian exile. And the text of Ezra and Nehemiah suggests that after something like 50 years, the people of Israel, the people of Judah, are allowed to return to the land of Judah. Now, the important thing to note, and it will become clear in your reading, is that not all of Judah went into Babylon. There were some that were left in Judah. And in fact, other places we learn that those that came from Judah were of the sort of the best. We might call them elite or powerful or wise or upper class. However we think about them, they were the best of the best, it seems like. And so and left those that didn't fall into that category. And so there becomes a tension between those who were forcibly brought into exile and those who remained in the land. And this tension becomes clear, especially when the people of Judah come back from exile, back into the land of Judah. Really, when we are reading Ezra and Nehemiah, we are beginning to read about the end of exile. And what's, I think, important to note about this time period is it wasn't just a one and done. It wasn't just one envoy of Judahites returning from exile. It was rather probably a progressive process with waves of folks returning to the Holy Land, returning to the land of Judah. And as we know, and as we know from other writings, not all Judahites returned to Judah. Many remained in diaspora. They found life in Babylon or elsewhere in the ancient world to be sufficient and adequate for their purposes, and so they remained there. I want to say a brief word about the kings of Persia. This is the Persian period. We've moved from the Babylonian period, and it is only with the end of the Babylonian rule that and the advent of the Persians that Judah and Jews are allowed to return to Judah. And so there's some notable Persian kings that appear in our literature. The first is Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the Second, as he is known, who ruled from approximately 559 to 530 BCE. And Cyrus is the one who pens the letter. He is the one who gives permission to the Jews living in Babylon to return to their homeland. And then there are a number of other kings, Darius I, 522 to 486, Artaxerxes the First, and now Artaxerxes is important because he's mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah, but there's three of them. Again, the sons and son of sons of Artaxerxes the First. But the first Artaxerxes is ruling from 465 to 424 BCE, and the last Artaxerxes the Third is ruling from 359 to about 338 BCE. And so again, just the timeline is somewhat important to keep in mind with the kings and with their rule, because we're going to see them mentioned in the text of Ezra and Nehemiah. And they're also important to note these dates because we can map them against some of what we know about the return of Judahites to Judah. So we begin to see the return probably around 538 BCE. Then around between 520 and 515, we see the reconstruction of the Jerusalem temple, the construction of the second temple, and that is done with the permission of Darius the First of Persia. And then we learn about Nehemiah being the governor of Judah, the provincial governor of Judah, from roughly 445 to 30 BCE, which would have taken place under the auspices of Artaxerxes the First. So again, we're sort of navigating these historical realities in a way that we haven't been able to with other Old Testament writings. Next, I want to highlight some of the importance of Ezra and Nehemiah as two or a single literary work, depending on how we think about them. The first is that we begin to see now that Judah will be a province and it will have its own governor. There will be some rule, some semi-autonomy, but Judah will never have a king again. And this is an important reality for the people of Judah, for the Jews, that this is really the beginning of a transition in their political and their religious and their social life together. It's also important to note that Judah really becomes distinct from Samaria. By this time, Samaria also will have its own set of semi-autonomous governance. And so the rivalry and the disagreements, the tensions that we've seen elsewhere between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom will continue. And these will become distinct political locations almost. The other importance of Ezra and Nehemiah is it captures these letters. There's letters from the kings or from the governor and so forth. And in general, you get the sense that we are much closer to the events on the ground than we were with, say, Deuteronomy. And while it's likely that these writings sort of were crystallized and finalized later than the events that they described, it does seem like they're closer. And so there is a bit of getting back to life on the ground. You sort of begin to see a little bit of what it might have been like in this time period. This really is, as Joseph Blankenship, an Old Testament scholar, has noted, this is really the beginnings of Judaism as we know it. This period of Ezra and Nehemiah is really when we move from what I might call the religion of Israel, or something like that, to Judaism. We begin to see this distinction of those Jews who are living in Judah and those who are living outside of Judah, something that will become a permanent reality for many of those outside of Judah. We begin to see the centrality of the temple. The construction of the second temple is is significant. In the early first century, Herod will have a building project where he tries to enhance it, but it really is this temple that we have in view as we move into the New Testament period. The law, Ezra and Nehemiah will talk about the law and a sort of rediscovery of the law and a reinstitution of obedience to the law. And this, again, becomes a hallmark of this land in this area in subsequent generations. And then, as I mentioned earlier, just the political reality that Judah becomes a province. It will be a province of Persia for a while, and then eventually for Greek, and then eventually for Rome. And so the provincial nature of Judah is really established with the rise and this events in Ezra and Nehemiah. As you read Ezra and Nehemiah, the selections that I'll suggest below, there are a few issues that you will encounter, a few topics, a few burning ideas that are important. The first has to do with reconstruction, right, and reconstitution. The exiles return to their homeland and find it in many ways in destructive state. The temple has been destroyed. The land that they know has been repatriated perhaps by another people group. There's that tension with those folks from Judah who didn't get forced into exile. And so the Persian kings authorize a rebuilding project on the part of the Judahites. But Judah's neighbors are not so happy about this, and so one of the realities that we see in this writing is this tension between Judah and her neighbors as they are doing the rebuilding of the temple, and Nehemiah is tasked with rebuilding the walls, the protective walls around Jerusalem. And of course, the neighbors think that Judah is preparing maybe for a battle, preparing for a rebellion, and so there's this tension that rebuilding is perceived as a threat. The second major issue that we see, especially with Ezra, the life of Ezra, and in the book of Ezra, is the Jewish law. The Persian king sends Ezra, to investigate the law, really to codify the law. What is the law of Judah? What are the sort of political and religious laws that are true to Judah? And so Ezra is sent to do that. And according to Ezra and Nehemiah, one of the things that we again see a clue in the text is that the people of Jerusalem had no knowledge of the book of law before Ezra arrives. It's sort of like Josiah earlier in 2 Kings. And so Ezra really reintroduces the law to the people of Jerusalem and establishes it as an important social and religious reality. The third issue to be aware of, and we see this in both Ezra and Nehemiah, is the issue of intermarriage. This in Ezra and Nehemiah is seen as a violation of covenant. It's an affront to God. The fact that people from Judah, the Jews, would marry folks who are not Jewish, folks from outside of Judah, is seen as a religious and social threat. And one of the things that John Collins, the Old Testament scholar who I've been reading along with in many ways, suggests that there are some economic reasons for this intermarriage. That, if the refugees, the exiles, have returned to their homeland and they want to reacquire their homeland, like their actual land, the way that they would have done that, one of the ways that they would have done that was through intermarriage. And so what we see in this work is this idea that this is a corruption of the, quote, holy seed. And this seems to be a new emphasis on intermarriage. Remember, intermarriage in the book of Joshua is all about religion, right? It's all that if you marry these foreign women, they're going to make you worship foreign gods. But in Ezra and Nehemiah, we begin to get a concern about what I would say is like ethnic purity, about maintaining the holiness, the purity, the set-apartness of a line. And this seems to be a very distinct emphasis that we see. The rejection of intermarriage is clearly seen in Ezra chapters 9 and 10 and Nehemiah chapter 13. So both of these reformers, both of these leaders really put an emphasis on this. And as you'll see, the practices are hard, and it seems like a very difficult period in time for many people, or at least we can imagine that it might have been. Finally, there were some other social and religious reforms, primarily carried out under Nehemiah. We see that Nehemiah, when he's governor, he takes these great efforts to respond to these two crises in the region. The one is a famine. There seems to be a famine throughout the year, or throughout the region, and there is this crushing debt. And it seems as though the Jews are in debt to one another, which is a violation of some of the Jewish law. And so Nehemiah enacts what we would call a jubilee year, a year where debts are forgiven, where the work is spread out, where the land is given rest. And it's a really important social and economic response on the part of Nehemiah. In addition, Nehemiah 13 talks about some Sabbath reforms, some ways in which Nehemiah is making the Sabbath a reality for the people of Judah. So what about all of this matters, and how do we engage this theologically? I think there's always the question about what about those that don't return? Ezra and Nehemiah focus, it's a laser focus on the return to Judah, but remember, these other folks are having another reality in diaspora, in exile. And so what about them? I think another really sort of problematic question that arises from Ezra and Nehemiah has to do with the exclusivist tendencies, seen especially by the rejection of intermarriage, but in other ways as well, that maybe not for the first time, but we get an emphasis on the particularity of the Jewish race, of the Jewish group, and in exclusion to others. And we have to balance that with what I think are some universalist tendencies that we see elsewhere, for example, in 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. And so as you read, as you think about this, how do we make sense of this tension between exclusivism, a particularity of the Jewish people, and the more universal tendencies of God's engagement with the whole created world? Let me conclude with just a few reading strategies. First of all, if you can't read all of Ezra and all of Nehemiah, that would be a hefty reading assignment. What I would invite you to focus on is Ezra chapter 1 and chapters 3 through 6, which depict the return from exile. They talk about sort of the reality of moving from Babylon back into Judah. And then Ezra 7 through 10 and Nehemiah 8 through 10. This depicts the career of Ezra, and you're probably saying, why do I have to read some from Ezra and some from Nehemiah? Well, that's just how these two books are written. That the career of Ezra is mentioned towards the end of the book of Ezra, chapters 7 through 10, and then he appears again on the scene in Nehemiah 8 through 10. And so this again is just a way of getting a sense of what was Ezra like, what was his career like. So that's why reading some from Ezra and some from Nehemiah. And then finally to read Nehemiah 1 through 7 and chapter 13, which will give you a sense of the career of Nehemiah. Again, focusing on their role in reestablishing Judah as the homeland for the Judahites, the Jews. As you read this material with those sort of focus points in mind, the first thing that you should be on the lookout for is the construction of identity through religion and reform. Remember, these are people who have experienced the trauma of being forcibly displaced. Some of those that had been displaced probably died in exile. Some have been born in exile, and so you can imagine the sort of the sort of confusion and anticipation and anxiety that they would feel in returning to their homeland. And so pay attention to the ways in which Nehemiah and Ezra are helping construct their Jewish identity through religious and other reforms. The second reading strategy is to pay attention to the relationship between Judah and the other cities and political or geographical cities in the area. Pay attention to how Judah is positioned to her surrounding neighbors. Well, I probably have given you too much to chew on in this before you read lecture, but I appreciate your time and your attention, and I hope that it provides some guidance as you engage Ezra and Nehemiah, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions about this material. Happy reading.